In today's episode, we'll take a closer look at one of the most famous, mythologized and lionized figures of the war, the desert fox Erwin Rommel.
Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. Hi, Jesse. Here we are again. Another week, another podcast. So we're continuing our journey, let's say it, through biographies and looking at perhaps important, perhaps famous, whatever you want to call them, individuals of the Second World War. And today, as I just said, it's Rommel's turn, probably one of the most famous, I just used the word, generals of World War II. So, as always, I throw it back to you. Where do we start? What are the tangents? What's the context? How far do we take it back? How many deep, dark woods do we find?
Well, in the case of talking about individual people, there is a historical limit, partially, to the depth of the tangents we can go, which is when the person is born. So we'll probably start around there in this case.
That's never stopped us. No, that's never stopped us.
So fate has at least put a partial break on the tangents for today. But first, a little housekeeping notice. I want to give a special shout out at the start of this episode to one of our Colonel supporters, Colonel level supporters. We have all sorts of different categories to supporters of the podcast, so you have something to choose from if you out there would like to support us. And this shout out goes to Mark Piper from Virginia in the United States. So thanks, Mark, for supporting us. We really appreciate it. To any of you out there who are thinking about supporting the podcast, you can do so by going to our website at bothsidesofthewire.com. In fact, this very episode is partly the result of feedback that we got from viewers and supporters who were interested in, let's say, controversial figures, well-known figures like Patton or Rommel or Montgomery or whoever. So, that out of the way, our story begins in 1891 in a little place in Württemberg in Germany, province in southwestern Germany. That's where Erwin Rommel, if I want to use the English pronunciation, is born. To cut a very long story short, it ends up that he gets interested in the military. He joins in 1910, and he goes to a cadet school in the town, as it was known at the time, of Danzig. And he comes out of it as a junior officer, as a lieutenant, which means that, of course, he fights in the First World War. And there's quite a bit here, so I'll flip it back to Matthias in a moment. But he starts out on the Western Front. He ends up at Verdun, but early in the war. He's wounded in September, and then eventually, he also receives the Iron Cross, first class at that time. And eventually, and this is where his reputation starts to take off, he gets transferred to the mountain troops. And he ends up serving in the Vosges Mountains in eastern France. And that's kind of, I think, the phase where the famous Rommel sort of slowly starts to build when he's in the mountain troops, and then he sees some action and makes his name. But I don't want to give it all away without giving Matthias a chance here.
Yes, I mean, as we said, where to begin? Obviously, well, the date of birth is not a bad one. So 1891, as you said. And Rommel is an interesting character, particularly compared to lots of his comrades, as we would say in the German military, not colleagues, that he fights alongside, particularly later on in World War II. Because as you already said, he comes from a small place in Württemberg. For those of you who don't know where that is, that's the southwest of Germany. At that time, it's a kingdom, so it's got technically nothing to do with Prussia, really. So it's its own little kingdom with its own military and all these things. And that is quite important in the German setting, because in the German setting at that time, and I would say to a degree it kind of runs through all the way to today, there are differences, there are distinctions on where you come from, what it means, not only for your general upbringing, but also for what you do in the military, and also how you can progress in the military and things like this. So we always look at Prussia at that time because that's the big state. And the moment you say the German military, everyone thinks of Prussia. I don't want to talk too much about First World War and all these things, but it might be interesting to note that there is no German army all the way up to 1919. The first time you have unified German army is the preliminary Reichswehr, the Vorläufige Reichswehr, which is founded in 1919. Before that, the German military is a military of contingent armies. That's what they call it. And one part of that is the army of the Kingdom of Württemberg. And he joins that. And why is that important? Because the structure of the state is a bit different. It's a bit more liberal. Whereas in Prussia, the officer corps, particularly of the established, the good regiments, is very, very much in the hands of the aristocracy. If you want to become a senior officer, it helps to have a font in front of your name, which is the German sign of being from the aristocracy. That does not necessarily apply to the same degree in Württemberg. And that's a good thing for Rommel because it's Erwin Rommel, it's not Erwin von Rommel. So if he joined the Prussian army, maybe he wouldn't have risen to the same sort of fame, you might say. And that's also represented in his upbringing. So he comes from a typical middle-class bourgeois family. So his father works in local government. He's a council. And again, in the Prussian system, that would have been kind of sniffed at, sneered as well. That's not good enough. Down there, that's perfectly okay. And what's also interesting is because he comes from there, he has a very, very distinct Swabian accent, which also sets him apart in this greater setting of Prussian/German, the German military at that time. Whenever you hear him speak, when you see all these propaganda clips that were made then during the Second World War, there's a very, very distinct Swabian accent, which people from the north quite often don't really kind of like that much. It's very, very different. It's a very German thing. So these accents, even today, they are fostered. You're encouraged to use your local accent. And after the second word or the first sentence, people know where you're from. Whereas in other countries, as we know, particularly the UK, accents are class-based. In Germany, it's very much a regional accent. That's fostered. And in that particular system, where the Prussian military is so dominant, you might say having an accent like this is a bit of a hindrance, or can be. So
I have a tangent, but I have an accent tangent, if you'll allow.
Absolutely, out with it.
A former flatmate of mine, we lived together for a couple of years. He was from a village in Swabia, and he was the first person I ever really knew who spoke with a Swabian accent. And it was so distinctive and so interesting. But I noticed how then other Germans would react to that, and they kind of made fun of it quite a bit. We were even traveling in a different town. We'd gone away for the weekend to go and check out, I think it was Budapest. And he said we were talking on the street, and there were German tourists who passed by and overheard him. And a complete stranger on the street, they just started imitating him and laughing. And now they might have been particularly unkind Germans, but it clicked for me then that, hey, this is a thing. This has some kind of cultural meaning inside of Germany. Anyway, that was the accent tangent. There you have it.
Well, I know when I went to Freiburg, which is Baden, so it's close to Württemberg, it's next to Württemberg. It's now one state, Baden-Württemberg. In the days of Rommel, these were two separate states. That's where the military archives is these days. So I've spent months and months and months there. And I remember going to a bakery and kind of pointing at things just like it was in a foreign country because they probably didn't want to understand my northern German accent. I had the same experience in Vienna, by the way, but let's not go there. I said, do you have, because I went to them, well, let's go there because I went to the military museum and I said, well, it says military discount. I said, brilliant. So do I get military discount as well? And they said it doesn't apply to a Piefke, which is the word used by the Austrians for Germans, which I thought was quite funny. I got it in the end anyway, but I thought it was quite funny. But that was already, we haven't even started talking about Rommel, and we're already kind of going left, right, center, up, down, and everywhere. So let's try to rein it back in, and let's get back to
right.
To Rommel himself. So as you already said, well, he joins the military, then goes to Danzig, which is interesting because Danzig in those days, of course, is part of Prussia. So you already have this connection there. And then he joins the army. As I say, his father was actually an artillery officer, so he joins the infantry, as you already explained, and he sees then all the action that you also mentioned. And as you said, the real breakthrough for him comes when he starts fighting in the mountains. Well, Württemberg is quite mountainous, some areas of it, so it kind of makes sense anyway to do this. And of course, the big breakthrough that happens in his career relatively early on is when his unit is sent to the Isonzo front, so that is Slovenia on the border to Italy. The famous Battle of Caporetto, 1917, which, by the way, is completely the wrong word. It's a very clever propaganda stint, you might say, by the Italians, because this place that everyone associates with this battle is a small town that even today is in Slovenia. It was never ever called Caporetto. That's the Italian word. It's either Kobarit if you're Slovenian, or it's Karfeit if you're German. So quite interesting again how propaganda plays a role here. But he gets involved there as well. And this attack, so one of the many Isonzo battles, the famous one, is the breakthrough of mainly the German forces supported by Austro-Hungarians through the Italian lines in the autumn of 1917. And this is where he really makes his name. So we don't want to spend too much time talking about the tactical stuff, what happens in the First World War. Suffice it to say that after short bombardment, the troops start attacking, and they attack more or less head-on the strong Italian positions on the top of the mountains. I've been there many times. It's an absolutely fascinating place. And you look at these positions and you think, how could you ever get thrown out of these positions? It's practically impossible. It happens. And Rommel is already beginning to use things and tactics he becomes known for later at a bigger scale as well. Infiltration tactics, just basically storming ahead, trying to unhinge the enemy's defenses, leading from the front, all that kind of stuff that he later becomes famous for, particularly in Africa. He already does here as a junior commander. Just to give you one or two ideas, from the 25th to the 27th of October, so he's got a company of about 150 men, and they go into the Kolovrat and the Matajur. These are the two big mountains that they fight over. So he's got 150 men, and in these 2 or 3 days, they capture 81 guns, 9,000 men, and lose about 6 dead and, roughly speaking, 30 wounded. And by the end of this campaign, his company, he claims, has captured 10,000 Italian soldiers. So that's quite big. And there's some really interesting little aspects here. Another small tangent. So when they're fighting at the one of these hills, so they've got the Italian position in front of them, and he doesn't really know how to attack. So he has a bit of a quick meeting with the company commander from the company next to him. And this guy is also a lieutenant, but lieutenant of the reserve. And that guy is a chap called Ferdinand Schörner. And Schörner, of course, like Rommel, becomes a very famous, in Schörner's case, very infamous field marshal of the Second War. Very, very pro-Nazi and these things. You've got these two very junior officers sitting there in this shell hole or wherever, discussing how to use their two companies to attack this Italian position. Schörner is the first one to then also get the Pour le Mérite, the highest decoration that Prussia, in this case, has to offer in the First World War, only awarded to officers, only to a handful of infantry officers. Most went to pilots or U-boat commanders. I think in total, when you look at lieutenants, I think it was only 11, but I would have to double check. Schörner's the first one. And here's also an interesting character trait of Rommel, because Rommel doesn't see that he's been written up for the Pour le Mérite. So he officially complains about this and says, I think I deserve this. And based on this complaint that he pushes up the chain of command, they look into it and they say, yeah, okay, you know what, that was very impressive. Have the Pour le Mérite as well. So it's a very interesting thing you see early on. So he was very, very good at promoting his own image. And that is, of course, something we will return back to later when we talk about World War II and all these things. That was quite a bit on the First World War, and I've been rambling for a while. I'm going to throw it back to you, Jesse. Anything else on the First World War, anything that we need to know from that period of his life?
Well, I think those are the grand lines. I would maybe just add that, yes, of course, he's involved in quite a feat for one company to achieve the things that his company achieved, but he's a part of German army infantry thinking and tactics that are changing at that point in the war. He's not the only one who's thinking about infiltrating the enemy, quickly getting behind them, stormtrooper tactics, one might say. So yes, he's particularly good at it and particularly bold, but he's not a complete, freak of nature outlier who thought of all this himself, that type of thing, right? He's a part of a system. He's ahead of the average, let's say, in that system. He's towards the head of the class, if you'll allow me that allegory or that metaphor. But, he's a part of this institutional thinking as well. He doesn't come out of nowhere. So I think that's important to keep in mind, even also when we think about him in the Second World War in different ways. So after the First World War, he, like most other Germans, and especially most other officers, not too happy about the outcome and about the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. However, he stays in the army. He stays in the Reichswehr, the interwar German army, which is, of course, much smaller. It's limited to 100,000 men, even though they make sure that that's very officer and NCO heavy with a future expansion in mind. He teaches at an infantry school in Dresden. I imagine that's, if you're a young officer cadet, you want to say, hey, I had a teacher who won the Pour le Mérite in the last big war. So I can imagine the appeal of the school for having him there. But after the Nazis take power, I'm skipping ahead here because I want us to be able to have some time on World War II. You can fill in any gaps that you think need to be filled. But basically, once the Nazis take power, he gets into a sort of a relationship with Hitler that's a part of what's going to make him a part of what makes his story significant and maybe controversial as well during the Second World War. He becomes slowly in the 30s a bit of a favorite of Hitler, to the point where he gets appointed commandant of the Führer's headquarters during the annexation of the Sudetenland in 1938. And also then, I guess he's the commandant of the bodyguard. I suppose it's an overlapping type of thing, all the way up into Poland as well. So already in the 30s, you can see that he has some kind of closeness to Hitler, that Hitler's positively disposed towards him. And that makes a difference, I think, for sure, to his story in the Second World War as well. I covered a ton of ground there just to make sure that we're moving in the right direction.
We can always do 2 or 3 or 10 or 15 episodes on Rommel. I don't think anyone would mind. I think exactly that's where do you start and where do you end with Rommel? I mean, it's a never-ending debate, isn't it, about him? Let's go back a little bit to the end of the First World War. So 1918, he's then finally promoted to Hauptmann, so that's captain, which in the modern, particularly in the English-speaking world, I would say is still quite a junior rank. In the German army at that time, it's a bit more senior. So German ranks, both in World War I, World War II, up to about 10, 15 years ago, I would say, were more senior than the English-speaking world equivalents. So as a captain, he would already be a company commander. That's how the orbit, the order of battle, works in the German system. It's only changed a few years ago for basically monetary reasons. That was the only reason why. And he then finishes the war. And as you said, well, he's kind of disillusioned. Germany has lost the war. That's not a good thing, let's face it, because you're an officer, you want to win the war. What are you going to do? He decides to stay in the army, as all of them try to do, obviously, because it gives you security, it gives you safety. Think about the economic situation in Germany. You've got revolution, everything's falling apart. Political mayhem. He gets involved in some of these events as well, where he's sent with his unit to bring peace and calm to some of the areas. And apparently, that's what some of the accounts at least say, is that he, just with his sheer kind of personal authority, managed to bring peace and calm to the areas he was sent to. Probably the Pour le Mérite helped, I'm assuming. Just flashing that at people would probably have helped. But you can also you begin to see a little bit of the political forming here as well, because this is something that no one wants to go back to. Even during the Weimar Republic, and then, of course, later on during the Hitler time, Hitler says the same thing. There's never going to be another November 1918. And that is the big trauma, isn't it, for German society, but in particular, of course, for the military and the officer corps. So he's not exempt from that. He then becomes a company commander down in Stuttgart and holds that post for 9 years. That is very, very long. And he only promotes to major in 1932. So that's 14 years as a captain. So everyone who's got a military background, if you listen to this now and you're complaining and whinging and whining about the slow promotion in your militaries today, you should be glad you weren't in the Reichswehr, because there simply weren't enough posts, because the army was so small, 100,000 men. And after that, as you say, then after that, things start to pick up a little bit quicker. So after Hitler comes to power in 1933, I think he's then already promoted to Oberstleutnant, so Lieutenant Colonel. You can see it then happens quite quickly. He's sent to the Dresden Infantry School, absolutely right. He serves there from 1929 to 1933. And that is interesting because it's not the first and only kind of teaching post that he has, and we'll cover that in a minute in a bit more detail. So people thought that he was quite good at getting lessons across, talking to people, instilling these ideas and principles, which is interesting because, of course, he himself never attended any sort of higher command course or staff college or something. That's because he goes through the war and then, well, he basically becomes a teacher. But apparently he had a very, very good report. And the Dresden school is quite interesting because in this big area there in Dresden is, again, today, big military barracks. And within that area, it's a big military quarter, you might say, of town. This is where you now have the German Army Officer School as well. So there's a bit of a link, if you want to call it that. And then, of course, we talked about the Nazis coming to power. In September 1934, that's the first time he actually meets Hitler because Hitler inspects some of the troops. At that time, he is in commander of a Jäger battalion, so light infantry battalion. And then in September 1935, he's moved to the Kriegsschule. And that's in Potsdam. So the way it works is in the old system, the imperial system, you go to a cadet institution if you want to do that because you also got A-levels there, or you went to a normal school, get your A-levels. You then go to the normal military academy. And if you're then chosen to move on and go a bit higher, that's when you would go to the Kriegsschule and the War Academy and have more courses and do more things. That building still exists. It's in Potsdam. After the First World War, it for a while also housed the military archives. So it's a very interesting building still there, sits on the only kind of hill you've got in the Potsdam area. And he was there for 3 years. And while he's there, he also writes this famous book, Infanterie greift an, Infantry Attacks, in which he basically sums up all the lessons from his fighting. In particular, of course, there's a lot about the Italian campaign in it. And that, again, kind of makes his name. In addition to being a bit of a war hero anyway, this makes his name because it becomes, I would probably say, a bestseller is probably the right word. A lot of people have it.
Yeah, I think it sold 400,000 copies or something in Germany at the time. That's huge for a military textbook, basically.
I think every self-respecting military historian should have at least one copy on the shelf. I'm looking at mine right now. It's up there. So it's very, very important. And it's said, whether it's true or not, probably is, that Hitler owned a copy as well. So there's a bit of a teaching thing going on there, and he's now in Hitler's eye line and eyesight, and he's okay. This is the great guy, so we can use him for other stuff as well. He then does a few other things. Say with the ministry is also then put in a position where he's supposed to liaise with the Hitler Youth Organization. That doesn't really go down well because he wants to take all the kind of the military training away from the Hitler Youth, put him into the army. That gets him into all sorts of trouble with the chap who's running the organization at the time, Hitler Youth, a chap called Baldo von Schirach. So you can see all sorts of other things, of course, happening as well. And if we just continue quickly with this teaching thing, before we can talk about other things, again, if we want to. He is then, after the Anschluss, after Austria joins, is occupied, depending on the point of view, and the argument becomes part of Germany, he is then made the commandant at the Theresia Military Academy. And that might not sound a lot to a lot of people, but actually is a big thing. Because not only is that the Austrian military academy, it is also, so they claim, the oldest military academy in the world. So there is a bit of a thing behind that. When you say you're the commandant of the Theresia Military Academy at Wiener Neustadt, even today it has a ring. I would argue, Austrians forgive me, the Austrian army isn't the biggest and strongest in the world, but Wiener Neustadt still means something. It has a ring to it, it has a feel to it. It's also quite interesting, and I'm jumping ahead a bit now, and I'm sure we will return to this later on. When you look at memory, commemoration, traditions, I remember being at Wiener Neustadt a few years ago for a conference, and they had pictures up of all the commandants of the academy, all the way from the 18th century to today. And there was a bit of a gap in between 1938 and the refounding of the Austrians in the 1950s, the Austrian army in the 1950s. And when I did point out that I've left out at least one very, very famous person here, we don't talk about this. So you're not talking about Rommel. You're also not talking about the fact and it was quite funny because I pointed out if you take out all these years that you don't commemorate, I don't think you're still the oldest military or longest established military academy in the world. That didn't go down well, as you can imagine. It was not making any friends there. I like the guys at Neustadt, but that I thought was quite funny. So that was interesting. And just one episode, maybe before I throw it back to you, and then we can perhaps finish this whole training thing and what he did. There is an anecdote that is being talked about, and it was written about as well. And it was told by, I think it was a chap called Kielmannsegg. Kielmannsegg is a very, very famous name in the German military because he becomes extremely important after World War II. And while Hitler is still one of the instructors, I think it is Kielmannsegg, he told this anecdote where they were somewhere on the shores of the Baltic Sea. So it might have been while he was at Danzig. I'm not entirely sure at which particular year this episode occurred. And Kielmannsegg said that we were given this extremely strange order, which was very, very odd. And we were all told in good Germanic fashion to goose step into the sea. I say, why do you do that? I mean, that's just plain stupid. But it is the German military, so everybody goose steps into the sea, as you do, because an order is an order. There was one person who refused to do that. And if I remember, it was Kielmannsegg. Listeners, if you know the story and you know it was a different name, please correct me. I think it was this famous name, Kielmannsegg. And he refused. And he told that Rommel, who was the instructor, came up to him and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Nothing, because basically this is stupid. I'm not doing this because what's the value of doing this? What does that teach me?" And he said, Rommel said, "Well, I gave you direct order. Carry out the order. Carry on." And he said, "No, I'm not doing it." And he then said, "Okay, you will see the consequences very, very soon." And he said, "Oh, bloody hell! Well, that's my military career gone." But then a couple of days later, they had sort of a company dinner or something like this. And Kielmannsegg, who thought that he would probably not even be invited, and he was just be invited to hand back in his uniform, he was actually approached by Rommel and said, "My dear Kielmannsegg, don't sit down there with your mates. You're going to sit at the top of the table right next to me because you've shown some backbone. And this is exactly what I want from my officers." And apparently, so the story goes, he then had a much quicker and more rapid promotion at that time than he should have had. So that also tells you quite a bit about the approach. Whether the story is 100% true, of course, is I wouldn't say debatable, but we probably need to look into a bit more. But I think it sets the tone quite nicely. It also might explain why he was held in high regard by both his superiors, but also his students, his subordinates, while he was at all these academies, trying to teach guys useful stuff. And of course, let's face it, you join the military, you join the Reichswehr, you go through all these training courses, and your instructor in infantry tactics is a chap who took 10,000 Italian prisoners, and he's prancing about wearing his pour le mérite. I mean, it doesn't get much better than that. So that in itself just carries some weight, doesn't it?
The only thing that would have made it better is if he'd been on a side that actually won. But anyway, I'm perhaps picking a historical bone there. In any case, I'd never heard that story about the goose stepping into the sea before, but it tracks with, Rommel's thinking, because even like at Caporetto, for example, he wanted to be much more aggressive than what some of his orders actually were, and found ways to do that. You can find ways to not receive your orders in the thick of battle if you really want to. And so I think that idea of taking initiative, or in some cases, let's say, deviating from the official order in its details, that kind of goes with his thinking about the war. And I'm not surprised to hear that story then, even though today was the first time that I had heard it. And of course, this is going to be a characteristic of his that is central to making his reputation, as being bold no matter what comes from the top. I'm not saying he was, always rebellious and totally undisciplined or anything like that. But in Africa, skipping ahead a little here, in Africa, for example, he really, really, really pushes the interpretation of his orders, especially that first year when he arrives in Africa. So we are now well into the 1930s. not even at the Second World War yet, as usual. That's how we do it. But another stage in his career that I think then makes quite a difference, and I referred to it briefly earlier, is this closeness with Hitler, right? You mentioned, okay, he meets Hitler, Hitler takes a shine to him that would also track. If he has this reputation, he has the pour le mérite, he has this reputation for, dashing and daring and aggressive and maybe a little bit devil may care. Well, Hitler likes that kind of approach. One might say, if you're being less than charitable, you could call it reckless. If you're being more empathetic, you can call it, bold and taking the initiative. So eventually, Rommel is made the commander of sort of Hitler's kind of bodyguard unit, if you will. And that's the position he serves in 38, 39. And from then on, I think it's fair to say, he has a fairly substantial relationship with Hitler. It's not always, super awesome, but it is substantial. There's a closeness there that lasts until Rommel's death in 1944. And I think that's plays into some of the controversies and debates about, what did Rommel know about war crimes, about the Holocaust. We'll get into that in a little bit. But the sort of die is cast at that time for his closeness with Hitler. And this is before he becomes even more famous as the commander of a tank division in the invasion of France.
Absolutely. I think a lot of people always kind of glance over this, but Rommel really appears in 1940 when he's made the commander of the 7th Panzer Division, and then of course Africa. But as you've just said, and as we've now talked about for about half an hour, there is of course a story before this, and there needs to be the context. And this is really, really important, because you might say, in addition to the pure military achievement, this is now his, what do you want to call it, political breakthrough. Political, not in the sense of him being political, but making or creating links to the political regime, to the political elites. And that is really, really fundamental. And as you said, so he's assigned after about 6 months or so at Wiener Neustadt, the military academy. He's then assigned to the Führerbegleitbataillon. It's good, by the way, it's one word, of course, because it's German. So it's not 2 or 3. No, it has to be one. And as you say, well, this is, you might say, it's Hitler's personal military bodyguard. Whenever he goes somewhere, particularly abroad, they would go with him and things like this. And in August 39, so before the outbreak of the war, Rommel is then also promoted again to Generalmajor. So it's a bit difficult. Generalmajor is quite often translated as Major General, because that is the literal translation, which technically is not quite right. You always, in the German system, you have to go, I would say, probably one down. I mean, it's very, very difficult, because in the German system, and I'm going to bore people with the German army structure. In those days, the divisional commander normally would not be a Generalmajor, but it would be Generalleutnant, which is one up. Whereas in, for example, the British system and the American system, even today, a divisional commander is a Major General. So be careful, kind of false friends, when you look at names, particularly when you see translations of these of the ranks, that you kind of try to get them into the right symmetry and order. When I started writing, I would also translate German ranks. So Generaloberst became Colonel General, which I looked at and thought, well, that looks a bit silly because it doesn't mean anything. So once I realized it doesn't really work, I've always used the original German ranks. And then you have a table somewhere which tells you what the equivalent is. But that's, again, just another little tangent. I could talk about ranks now forever, but I think that's probably enough. And so he's Generalmajor. And that, of course, means also he's in charge of that Führerbegleitbataillon. So he's not just one of the guys who's there, but he's the man. And that, of course, means he has very, very close interactions with Hitler, particularly now when the war breaks out and Hitler jumps on his train to go to the front or what have you, because this is when the Begleitbataillon and, of course, Rommel would go with him and be with him basically daily and interact. And you can see, as you already said, this is the beginning of this. This links to the whole question of his political views, but maybe we park that and return to that later, because that's another huge topic, which we probably went, another Pandora's box, which we have to open at some point. But if we do it now, we got a huge major tangent out. I've got in about 5 hours' time, I will have no idea where we left off. So let's maybe do the other bit first, then return to the political views.
Right, the other bit meaning the invasion of France.
The military side of things, yes. Mm.
So, France is really where I think the legend, if you will, for lack of a better word, that can be positively or negatively connotated, depending on which part of it one wants to focus on. But I think the legend of Rommel as this dashing, daring commander who takes risks, and those risks work out, comes from France in 1940, right? He's in command of the 7th Tank Division. He commands it in a way that is very daring, very bold, taking a lot of risks, pushing ahead despite open flanks, pushing ahead despite logistical problems, despite, shortages of fuel, all these kinds of things. And he ends up reaching the channel. He's among the first to fully achieve this cutoff of Allied forces that eventually are evacuated from Dunkirk. So he's only a divisional commander on the one hand. On the other hand, what he does with that division, and of course he's not the only one in this spearhead, but he is at the head of it more or less. And his self-promotion skills probably don't hurt him here either, but there is fire where there's smoke in this case. And so he makes his reputation there. He also is moving around all the time, up with the tanks and things like that. So this is also something that lends itself to the legend, something that lends itself to being mentioned in propaganda reports or news reports. He earns then the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross for this for his performance, let's say, in this campaign. And then the Rommel that we know 80 years later, or we hear about 80 years later, is really off and running after the France campaign.
And you can see, as you already said, basically everything that we associate with Rommel, particularly North Africa, comes to the fore here. The good, the bad, but also the ugly. We can look at one or two examples. Say, it starts to advance with the division. Right from the beginning, his superiors are not overly happy because he's not all that good at communicating and following orders and looking at the flanks to the left and right. He just pushes ahead, as he'd done in Caporetto in 1917, and as he will do later on in North Africa. I mean, it comes with successes. So again, his troops, not only his troops, but together with other German forces, of course, they more or less shatter a French corps in mid-May, where his division, again, is taking about 10,000 French casualties. And I think they've got 30 casualties on the German side or something like this. So 10,000 seems to be a recurring figure when it comes to taking prisoners by Rommel, just like in 1917. And that's all very good. And of course, the Ghost Division, as they then become known, because they just rush ahead and they're so far ahead that no one knows where they are, neither the Germans nor the Allies. And that, of course, is part of this whole doctrine you already mentioned. Even though he's extremely daring, it's all part of the German doctrine, which was developed in the First World War. Get behind the enemy front line, shatter the enemy's will and cohesion to fight. That's more important than actually defeating the enemy forces through fighting. Just confuse them, spread panic in the rear areas, and they do that extremely well. And as of course, because it's Rommel, he tends to lead from the front. But there are also some aspects where sometimes you can see this whole ego thing comes to the fore as well. And there's one episode that we might want to talk about for a good 2 or 3 minutes, which is really sums all this up extremely nicely. So the good aspects, but also the bad aspects. And that is the British counterattack at Arras, and I think it's the 21st of May, 1940. We can do a whole episode on this. I'm not going to go into all the detail, but just a very simple say that the German troops have, you might say, overextended themselves, pushed forward a bit too much, and the British then launch a counterattack. In the end, it's defeated by the Germans because the British way of fighting at that particular point is not, forgive me, not particularly sophisticated. They're not using a mission command, and in the end, the Germans win. It gets very, very close to a German defeat. And while the British tanks advance, Rommel then rushes forward because his logistical trail is being shot to pieces, and there's panic is beginning to spread amongst the German troops. He arrives there, sees the situation, and establishes basically an anti-tank flak Riegel, as they call it, so defensive line. In the end, suffices to say, I don't want to talk about the whole tactical stuff here, the Germans managed to defeat this British counterattack. But what is interesting is then the next thing that he does, because he then writes a report in which he tells about the battle and what he'd done. And when you read this report, it's really interesting because it completely exaggerates the number of troops the British had, the number of tanks that they had, and points the situation in an even worse light than he actually encountered when he got there. Sent that report back up the chain of command, and people have argued this is one of the reasons why in the German high command, you might perhaps say panic strikes a little bit at that particular stage, because they're worried that the French and the British might launch counterattacks and then attack in the flanks and cut off the German troops that are spearheading towards the channel. And that being one of the reasons why the German troops are told to basically stop, slow down. It's a very famous discussion with Guderian. We're not going to go into this one now. But you can see the negative implications of his action as well, because he's very good at self-promoting. He wants to present himself in this very, very important I saved the battle, I saved the campaign by personally, physically being there exactly in the spot on the hill. There's actually a hill which is now called Rommel Hill. You can go there and see the battlefield. That's where he stands and conducts the battle from. Say, yes, he saves the day, you might say, but the aftermath is, for him, glorious. But if you put it into the operational context of 1940, you might call it a hindrance or something worse, probably.
Yeah, I mean, if you are essentially passing along partly false information to make yourself look good, even if it's not completely fabricated, we won when we actually lost, or we captured when we actually didn't capture. I mean, we hear about that even now in the news with some armies that are fighting today. Even if you're not doing that, if the twisting goes a little too far, then your superiors are making decisions based on partly false information, and that can have a detrimental effect, as you mentioned. So that's not what an officer is supposed to do, right? That's going against the ethos that he was supposed to have taken from his own time as an officer cadet in Danzig or whatever, and the ethos that he was supposed to put into his students in Dresden as well. So ego is such a deeply rooted human thing. We all have one. We all want to see ourselves in a good light, and it's very, very hard in some situations, especially if your job requires you to be extremely confident, which, being a military officer, usually you have to be that, or at least be able to act like that, even if inside you're not. That balance between doing what you're supposed to do and keeping that ego in check, and not letting that confidence be, but not letting it get the better of you when it shouldn't, is a very, very, very hard thing for most humans. And I think, we see yes, we can critique Rommel for this, but it's also a very human flaw. I mean, who doesn't want their boss to think that they're awesome at their job, right? If you want to boil it down a little bit. So I think, a little historical empathy helps us understand why this happens. And, he's not just some malicious egomaniac. I think there's a few other factors in the mix here as well.
That is very, very true.
All right, folks. So now we've brought the story of Rommel up to maybe the start of his peak in terms of reputation, how famous he is for this legend, this myth of Rommel, the soon-to-be Desert Fox, at the moment the commander of the Ghost Division after the invasion of France in 1940. I think that's a good point to sort of make a little bit of a break for this episode, and we'll pick up the story of Rommel and the controversies surrounding him after this. I want to thank all of you out there for listening and watching. I also want to remind you that if you want to support the podcast, you can do that at bothsidesofthewire.com. You can get free access, by the way, a free trial access, I should say, to some exclusive content over there in our war room. And you can even get the free trial by using the code word Deep Dark Woods. So we hope to see you there, and we will see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening. I'm just waiting for you. So if you're on camera, that they don't see that you're eating or whatever, which I don't mind, of course. But yes, that could be a meme.
It could be like a capybara.
I don't know why capybaras and axolotls all of a sudden became the most popular animals.
I have to say, I've been a capybara fan for about a decade.
No one ever heard of these creatures before.
The first time I saw one was in Berlin Zoo. I thought, what the heck is that funny rodent? Since that day, I've been a huge capybara fan. I can make it official here. That's an official statement. But I was also quite surprised because I went to the petrol station here not long ago, and it was they had all these mascots for the Football World Cup. And they had all these capybaras dressed in England football shirts. That wouldn't have happened 4 years ago. So I thought that was a bit strange. So I'm a trendsetter. There we go. That's never happened before.
I don't get it. My nieces are talking about axolotls as though everybody knows about this creature. I mean, I was the biggest, nature nerd when I was a kid. Dinosaurs, animals, whatever. I'd never heard of an axolotl. I don't know. Whatever. The times, they are a-changing.
Yeah.
As
I like the German.
As a great singer once said.
Water rat. Wasserratte. That's a great name. Yeah.
That was the nickname of my grandfather's infantry division because they spent all their time in flooded Holland, essentially, in 44-45.
And they all were filthy, just as capybaras. Yeah.
No doubt.
That happens.
No doubt. I'm sure they were filthy much of at least that's what he told me. Anyway, good Lord.
That's a funny tangent.
That'll all have to be cut out.
Well, I fear they're going to leave that in as a tangent.
They're probably going to leave in the capybara thing, yes. Okay.